Good evening, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Please just give me one quick second to double check to make sure everything is working on my end, because whenever I don't check, that is when issues arise. Unfortunately, everything does seem to be working today, so I'm not going to waste too much time with preamble today. But today we're going to be looking at One Piece, which is, 1999. So we're almost at the 2000s, so that's another big milestone coming up soon. But we're going to. I know this is like one of the big titles on the list. That one of the ones that's. I don't know if it's. I think there are others that are definitely a lot more influential than this one that are on the list, but this is probably one of the most successful ones on the list, and it's also the second of the anime so far that we've seen that I have actually seen, or at least I've seen what we're going to be watching today, because I've watched the first 20 something episodes in the past. I did not end up keeping up with the whole thing, because eventually it just got to be, I realized it was like too much, and also filler stuff. But yeah, I'm not a big filler fan. But so this will not be a blind watch, but as even though I do know what's coming, I do know what the show's about, I have seen these 3 episodes before. Let's start with reading the summary blurb, because that's just how we've been doing things. Barely surviving in a barrel after passing through a terrible whirlpool at sea, carefree Monkey D. Luffy ends up aboard a ship under attack by fearsome pirates. Despite being a naive-looking teenager, he is not to be underestimated. Unmatched in battle, Luffy is a pirate himself who resolutely pursues the coveted One Piece treasure and the King of the Pirates title that comes with it. The late King of the Pirates, Galdie Roger, stirred up the world before his death by disclosing the whereabouts of his hoard of riches and daring everyone to obtain it. Ever since then, countless powerful pirates have sailed dangerous seas for the prized One Piece, only to never return. Although Luffy lacks a crew and a proper ship, he is endowed with a superhuman ability and an unbreakable spirit that make him not only a formidable adversary, but also an inspiration to many. As he faces numerous challenges, with a big smile on his face, Luffy gathers one-of-a-kind companions to join him on his ambitious endeavor, together embracing perils and wonders on their once-in-a-lifetime adventure. So one thing I will also say is this might also be another example of a show that is harmed by the way I'm approaching this particular video, because it was definitely harmed by the original TheAnimeMen's video, by just watching episode 1, but one of the things I actually really like about One Piece as as a creative work is the fact that it's very slow to get moving, and not that's usually like a bad thing to a lot of people, but I actually really like how they have an ensemble cast, a pretty sizable one in fact, but they introduce them one character at a time and let each one have their own tiny introductory arc that lasts like a couple episodes each. So they actually get an idea of who each of these characters is and how they interact with the rest of the group. So they get to establish themselves, establish their motivations, but also establish their relationships with each individual other member of the ensemble cast, so that when you have everybody together as a group, then all of a sudden, like, you actually understand everything. Everything makes sense. There's no confusion going on. And everything, one of the issues with ensemble casts oftentimes is that there's just too many characters for the runtime. And I think One Piece's approach of introducing them one at a time is probably the best way you could possibly do that and have it also just make sense. And I think the fact that One Piece is such a long-running show does also contribute to the fact that they're able to do this. If for a show that doesn't have over 1,000 episodes of buffer time, that's not necessarily going to be viable. But that is something I do really like about it, but it's also something I can't really consider in this particular ranking video that I'm going to be doing, because I'm only going to be judging the first 3 episodes. And even though I do know what comes up next, I still think that just because I do know what comes after this, it still wouldn't be fair of me to take my prior knowledge and factor that into the final review. So I will say one of its biggest strengths, I feel, at least one of its biggest early strengths, is going to not really be represented in the final ranking video. I'll reference it, but also it probably won't contribute to the final score, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. The original video that I'm remaking essentially was flawed, and as a result, there's going to be some flaws in mine, and I'll just have to work around them. So, with that being said, let's get started. I'm going to skip the intro just because copyright has been a consistent issue, especially with the OPs. Don't really want to continue dealing with that, so I hope you understand. And of course, I know the OP. I've seen this show before. And I will say, I do like the way this opens up to kind of highlight the nautical nature of the show, while also showing some of the more supernatural elements of things with that giant whirlpool going on, and nobody seems to care about it. It's a good way of just kind of establishing the overall tone of this setting. Luffy is essentially the protagonist of the series. While it is an ensemble show, and ultimately there's no one character that's the big person and everything else surrounds that person, Luffy's the closest you kind of have to that, where he is really the main character. So I find it interesting that the first major character we actually see is Nami, who is, again, she's a very important character. She's part of the main group, but she's not the protagonist. So I do find that kind of interesting. They do the kind of thing that a lot of old Disney stuff used to do, whereas they made their villains just unapologetically grotesque, where they just have these really just odd, intense visuals to them that just really just say, yeah, this is the villain. And it's this kind of thing, you don't see it quite that often anymore. It's just kind of fallen out of favor, but I've always felt they had a very specific type of charm to it. And also I do like how they're kind of immediately establishing that the villains of this series, because I know obviously it's One Piece, there's multiple bad guys throughout the course of the series. There's no like one primary antagonist, at least not in this early section of the story. But yeah, I love how they're establishing that these villains are going to be kind of crazy and over the top and just ridiculous, and also that it's not going to conform to our real world expectations of what pirates in this setting would be. It's like, as an example, while there have certainly been female pirates in the past, the majority of them were not female. Although, interestingly, a lot of the most brutal ones were. So, there definitely was, like, Anne Bonny, and I know there's that one Chinese woman who ended up with a massive fleet of pirate ships, and absolutely wreaked havoc. But for the most part, we expect pirates, at least in the real world history, are mostly men. They mostly behaved in a certain way. They weren't quite as cartoonish as they're often depicted. So this initial showcase is showing that it's basically a cartoon supervillain. Not even a supervillain, just a cartoon villain is going to be how the pirates, the evil pirates at least, of this setting are going to behave. And just this initial introduction to this particular villain, who's not even going to like stick around, is a great way of just immediately telling the audience, yeah, this is what you can expect with this show moving forward. And I do actually think that's a pretty effective way of also does correct a potential misunderstanding that an audience member could have, the idea that a lot of times you assume that that larger characters like that are usually physically incompetent, just again because if you're extremely overweight in the real world, you tend to not be particularly athletic. There are exceptions, of course, but that's the general trend. So showing her as being strong and capable and actually surprisingly agile, again, a good way to immediately dispel that before it becomes somewhat relevant in due time. This particular interaction was done for the sake of exposition to the audience, to basically say, hey, this is what King of Pirates means. This is what the main brunt of the show, what the MacGuffin is, how this is gonna be moving forward. The goal at the end of the shonen, essentially. But so I do feel like this particular interaction is kind of forced, but I also just don't find it super convincing that this kid Kobe would be so shocked to hear that Luffy is trying to be king of the pirates, because it might just be an issue of perspective as well, because we see things from Luffy's perspective, so things can definitely, he probably has a somewhat skewed perspective on as far as who he interacts with. But I imagine a lot of people like who are in the nautical life kind of have, even if they're not actively working towards it, they kind of have these loose ambitions and desires to want to be the king of pirates, because it's just this big thing that everybody knows about. So like, I don't see why he's just so flabbergasted by the idea that Luffy wants to be king of the pirates. I don't know. I feel like a lot of this was just kind of set up to make Kobe just kind of crash out and tell us about the One Piece. Oh, shit, sorry. Monitor, as I need to really fix that someday. My monitor likes to not always, excuse me. Yeah, unfortunately my monitor does not fit its plugs super well, so sometimes it just decides to freak out a little bit, and I have to fix the plug, and then it just decides to put everything on my main monitor, which is annoying, but it's whatever, and it also makes YouTube freak out a little bit, but, you know, it is what it is. Sorry about that. But it's fixed now. Oh. Fuck off, Malwarebytes. Here, because they haven't fully revealed his powers yet, but they are showcasing them to a little bit. Because you can see that he is kind of stretching a little bit to increase his power. He's a little more flexible than he should be. But to somebody who's not aware of what's going to be happening, they don't really know anything. They're a first-time viewer. They're going in blind. They're not going to know that he has stretchy powers, so they're just going to assume these are just general animation techniques, like the regular stuff that is fairly normal with this type of thing. Like, again, it's actually, you know, some squash and stretch is very, very common in 2D animation to make things have more impact. It was like, if you look at old Looney Tunes cartoons, like, that was like a staple of how those worked. Old Disney stuff, even, you know, a lot of old anime had a lot of squash and stretch. So you assume this is just an artifact of the animation style, but it's actually part of his powers. So I do think that's a really clever way of kind of just playing around with the audience's expectations. Doing a crazy amount in this first episode, because, again, I will say that I believe the introductory sequence of One Piece, even calling it an arc is not really super fair, because I feel like it almost is like several different arcs. I mean, whatever, I guess you can call it an arc of gathering the entire crew together, even though it's kind of split up into little mini arcs of, like, you know, 3 episodes each. So, like, each individual episode is not doing a whole lot, because the opening section of this show is relatively slow-paced, and I don't think that's a negative thing, honestly. I think that's actually one of its strengths. So it's, you know, I can't heap tons of praise onto the episode 1 on its own, even though I do think it's actually a pretty effective introduction to the setting and introduction to the main objective of the series, which is going to be to find the One Piece and, you know, have an immediate goal of find a crew. And again, we don't really know much about Luffy just yet at this point. Obviously, I know a little bit more about it since I've seen part of the show before, but again, it's kind of a good baseline character introduction to him as well. And just a little bit of teasers for some of the other cast members like Nami and Zoro. So yeah, overall, episode 1 I think is pretty good. And I think it also does a very good job of being a good hook for the show, where you actually do kind of want to keep watching it afterwards. So I am saying it's not doing a whole lot. That's not really a criticism. It's more of just an acknowledgement that it's, you know, it's still cooking ultimately. Oops. Oh shit, sorry. I missed the skip intro button because I apparently have no hand-eye coordination.
もうすぐ海軍基地の島が見えてきますよ。へえ、コビー、お前すごいな。ちゃんと目的地に着くのか。当たり前です。海に出るものの最低限の能力です。笑ってる場合じゃありませんよ、ルフィさん。そこに捕まってるんです。あの有名な海賊狩り。血に飢えた獣のように賞金首を襲い。
Again, character design I think in this show is pretty consistently great. Main cast I think does tend to be a step above the other characters, but overall, the main cast and the villains I think all have generally very good character design, which I think is especially important in a show that's going to be as long running as this one, because I mean, there's got to be stuff that keeps you going after, you know, 1,400 episodes. Or however many it is. I know it's a lot.
あの基地にいるのかな、ゾロってやつ。
And this whole sequence is a little bit over the top, but it does a good job of showcasing, even in a fairly blunt way, the reputation that Zoro has gained. And that kind of builds on the initial sinister introduction we've had of him. I will also say they're kind of like the previous episode, but in a different way. They are playing around with audience expectations, where you hear that this guy's a pirate, Luffy, but you figure he might be an exception, and pirates are generally assholes, which a lot of them are, not all of them though. And you would assume that the people fighting the pirates are probably going to be the good guys, broadly speaking. We don't yet know that the Navy is not entirely, but largely comprised of assholes themselves, and that it's a kind of not really any good guys in the broader societal sense. I also do like Zoro as a character, not necessarily because of his writing, at least in this early segments. I think, again, I think I haven't really seen the full extent of what the character's capable of, but I do love how just unapologetically edgy he is. Like, it's almost like to the point of borderline self-parody. Not quite, though, but... Like, he's edgy, but I feel like he's edgy in a very self-aware way.
Nanda?
And I also do like this little sequence a lot. Again, it's pretty... It's not particularly subtle what they're doing here, but kind of having this little bit of character development with this, the pure-hearted little kid is a great way of kind of breaking, the little bit of... Again, expectation subversion is the phrase I've been using. Probably not the perfect word I could be using, but the whole idea is they're setting up this guy to be this badass piece of shit, basically, where he's, ruthless, doesn't really care about anything aside from his objective. He might not be deliberately cruel necessarily. Again, the way they've been presenting him, you could kind of interpret it either way. But he also does come across as the type of character who doesn't really care about any kind of collateral damage or how anything affects anyone besides him. However, this scene, I think, is a great way of showcasing that that's not necessarily true. You don't yet know his motivations. You don't yet know what kind of person he is deep down. But the fact that he is kind of, while maintaining his kind of prickly outside, he is interacting with this kid in a way that shows that he's not, as gruff and antagonistic as he comes off, where he actually, because how could you hate a little kid who kind of earnestly decides to be friendly to you and try to feed you? Like, it's a sweet little kid, and he's trying to get rid of her, but for her own benefit, essentially, and he's doing it in a way that he doesn't want to actually admit that he's doing something nice. So it is actually a pretty solid way of doing the character work before we actually know more about him. And while he's doing this in a very aggressive way, to the point of deflecting any kind of negativity onto him and off of the girl. So I think it's actually pretty impressive. Yeah, and again, it's a little bit... Oh, son of a bitch, it happened again. I do apologize. It usually does not happen quite that frequently, but yeah. Again, for those of you who missed it earlier, one issue I do have is the what do you call it? My monitor, the plug doesn't quite fit. I do need to see if it's actually just an issue with the plug itself. That's actually a really easy fix. I should just buy another one. Probably wouldn't hurt to have a spare anyway, but yeah, so I'm not sure if it's the plug or if it's the actual jack that doesn't fit, but yeah, it is not ideal, unfortunately. There we go. Okay. So yeah, again, I shoved it back in, so hopefully it'll actually hold, but yeah, sometimes it can be a little bit unpredictable. But I mean, before I interrupted myself with technical difficulties, one thing I will say is this does feel a little bit heavy-handed. The idea of showcasing that this Navy guy is not is kind of the villain of this episode, at least, where he's just like how much more of an asshole can you really get as just like a generic asshole before kind of going into outright evil territory, which what else is the better way to showcase a generic asshole than by having him be a dick to a sweet little kid, essentially? Like, again, it's like about as heavy-handed as you can possibly get without like having them actually like torture and murder people. But it is a good way of showcasing. Again, they're showing these little bits of expectation subversion, or not. It's not really expectation subversion. It's more like little contradictions to the things they've kind of been softly implying up to this point, with the things they've implied being like, that Zoro is just an evil character himself, or that the Navy are the good guys, because we saw that the Kobe, who is established to be a good guy, wants to join the Navy for the pursuit of justice, to actually catch the evildoers in the world. So we've kind of been primed to assume that the Navy are the good guys, that Luffy is essentially the exception to the rule as far as pirates go, and that Zoro is a bad guy. But now we see little indications that Zoro is trying to kind of look out for this kid's well-being, trying to shoo her away. Even though he does it in a mean way, it's for her benefit more than anything. And also because it, kind of shifts any kind of negativity onto him, where it shows him bullying a kid, not a kid trying to sympathize with a pirate. And then we show the actual Navy person acting like a total asshole, showing that, okay, maybe the Navy aren't actually solely the good guys. And of course, it is a little bit more complicated than that. But again, they're starting to show these little cracks in what they've established so far, and that's done in a very deliberate way. So I do think this is done pretty effectively overall. Like, it's a good way of, they kind of had that initial hook from the last episode, and then they're slowly starting to kind of add little bit of layers of nuance and just additional factors for us to consider. And yeah, I overall do think it's a pretty effective way of building on that initial hook to keep the viewers invested before the real story has a chance to unfold. I will say that's interesting how the header says Marine on it in English, but then the actual contents of the letter are in Japanese. I don't know if there's actually meant to be like a world building element to that, but I don't know. I might just be a case of I've been a little spoiled by the Mushoku Tensei anime, because they actually do some really interesting things with the linguistic side of things, even stuff that the books didn't do, which I probably should not expect that level of care to the in-universe linguistics and languages and translations and stuff like that to actually be a thing in most other anime, because I imagine Mushoku Tensei is just kind of special in that regard. So, but it is an interesting thing to think of. Okay, and then another kind of heavy-handed but effective way of showcasing that, this guy's basically, he's not necessarily competent on its own, but he's a bit of a nepo baby. Here you go. And then does the same kind of thing that they were showcasing with the pirates, and I think that's actually a nice parallel with the pirates from previous episode, showing that the pirates are not necessarily all that evil on their own, and that they are ultimately kind of with the bad guy, because the bad guy rules by fear more than anything else. And that, that little tiny act of rebellion just goes to also kind of, again, kind of insert a little bit of nuance into the conversation, where we were first introduced to the idea that, okay, the Navy might actually be the good guys because this Morgan guy is an asshole who is, doing asshole things. But there's also seems to be decent people there as well who kind of want to do the right thing in their own ways. And, this tiny act of rebellion is their way of, again, trying to accomplish that while also looking after their own skin.
ありがとう。大丈夫ですか、ルフィさん。
Like, as much as a lot of what this show is doing is pretty,
なんてひどいやつなんだ。
on the nose and also fairly over the top, it actually is doing a lot of little things as well that I think are actually surprisingly effective, especially for the first couple episodes of a shonen anime, which, I'll be honest, a lot of shonen out there, it's not uncommon for the early episodes of a shonen to be kind of weak. Because I think a lot of shonen tend to kind of live and die by their generic formulas, where kind of once it's in like the main stretch of what it's doing, that's kind of where a lot of shonen shine. So it's actually very nice to see. I won't say it's a pleasant surprise because I've seen this before, but it is actually a pleasant experience to see a shonen that actually is kind of taking its early storytelling pretty seriously.
俺は必ず生き延びてみせる。絶対に。
へえ、物好きなやつ。
ちょっと待て。
あ、
それ取ってくんねえか。
食うのかよこれ。もうほとんど泥の塊だぞ。
黙って食わせろ。
あ。だから言ったろ。
うまかった。ごちそうさま。
Okay. And I will say another little thing of note is that there is a slight translation issue there, which I'm not going to even blame anybody for it, because it's essentially there's no real concise way to translate the nuance of that statement over to English, because we don't have the same, linguistic thing in our language. Because one thing I've mentioned, and again, this is not exactly like crazy revelations. This is pretty common knowledge from anyone, and I am far from an expert in this regard, so don't act like I'm speaking with any kind of crazy authority here. But one thing about the Japanese language is that there are a lot of little cultural markers in the language itself. And one of those is that a lot of Japanese speech is fairly ritualistic, and I mean that in ways that there are just certain back and forths that happen just throughout day-to-day Japanese speech that are just that way because just culturally that's what they do, that's what they say in these circumstances. And English doesn't quite have the same type of thing. It does to a lesser extent, but it's not as formalized as it is in Japanese. And one of those things is that I can't even remember the phrase, because I'll be honest, I know some Japanese. I don't really remember all the ritual phrases. Let me see. Let's see. Yeah, gochiso-sama. So one thing that's one of the rituals that is very common in Japanese is when you're eating. The one that everybody knows, even if you don't know really any Japanese, you'll know that one thing that Japanese people will say before eating is itadakimasu. And you can see at the end it said gochiso-sama. Or I completely mispronounced that. I don't care. It's been a long day. But the idea is that there's usually are described as thanks for the food or let's eat or something like that. In English, that's about as close as you can get in a concise way, because actually explaining the nuance would take more time and would actually fuck up the pacing if you actually took the time to fully explain the nuance in English. It's because English doesn't have these types of rituals. This is just how they interact. So while thanks for the food is sort of accurate-ish, it's also, an indicator that he's following these rituals, that he's acting in a way that is like not as rebellious as you would think he is. He's actually doing the polite interactions for what you do when you eat, and essentially what you do after eating a proper meal. So the fact that he's doing that is not expressing gratitude for the food necessarily. He's essentially participating in this societal ritual. Again, it is hard to explain the nuance of it, but it's kind of like when we were talking about when we were watching Neon Genesis Evangelion, and they had the little bit of linguistic ritual for what you say when you enter a home, which you have a different statement you say when you enter somebody's home as a guest versus when you enter your own home, so that when Misato corrects Shinji and says, no, you say this and not this because this is your home. Again, it's another little linguistic bit of nuance that doesn't quite exist in English. So that's kind of what this statement is doing. So it does actually get the core idea across, the fact that he's, showing a little bit more humanity than he likes to reveal on the surface. But at the same time, it's not quite translated over perfectly to English, and there's nothing the translators could have really done to address that. So I just find that interesting, and it's also one of the reasons I strongly advocate that if you're going to consume a lot of media in a particular language, it is very worth learning the basics of that language. So, if you watch a lot of anime, learn the basics of Japanese. Like I'm talking learn like a week or two of basic study. Same thing if you're watching, Korean stuff, learn Korean, or Spanish, learn Spanish. Again, doesn't have to be fluent, doesn't have to be even close to conversational. But just a little bit can get you a lot of extra nuance that that's not always going to be translatable, essentially. It's again, I will say within the first, probably the first week, I started seriously trying to learn some Japanese. I started noticing a lot of little things that I missed previously. So it's definitely a very rewarding thing to do, I think.
ああ、一つ残らず食っちまったよあいつ。嬉しい。ゾロって本当に噂ほどの悪人なんでしょうか。違うよ。だってお兄ちゃん、私たちの代わりに貼り付けに。
And again, I will say that this particular little bit of exposition is again, it does fit the circumstances, and because Luffy is essentially a fish out of water, and Kobe is a fish out of water in this particular island or city, it does make sense for them to be exposited at, but also it does feel, a little bit, again, a little on the nose of saying, oh yeah, he's not actually as evil as he comes across, which you could logically assume based on previous the things we've already seen.
なんだ貴様はお前はまさか海賊狩りのゾロかだったらなんだ海賊狩りがなんで海軍に盾つくんだ飯くらい静かに食わせろ
I actually do. One thing I will say that is, as much as they're doing everything they can to make you dislike Morgan, because that's the type of character they're trying to cultivate, I actually do appreciate the weird kind of almost cognitive dissonance that comes with a character who is kind of simultaneously arrogant and cowardly, because those two traits can oftentimes clash with one another, where arrogance can kind of, in this case, you can see the arrogance somewhat overcoming his cowardice, and I always thought that was a cool thing. Hey, Alan, good to see you. And I know they also haven't explained it yet, but I also do like the fact that he has 3 swords. It's one of those things where it kind of goes to what I was saying earlier, where one of the things I like about Zoro is that he's just unapologetically over the top, where it feels like the writer was just very self-aware when they crafted this character. Hey, it's no problem. We're actually getting through this pretty fast, so... Oh, excuse me. So you're probably not going to miss a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. Oh, jeez. Something got caught in my throat. Sorry about that. I don't know what that is. Ugh. Sorry, I actually need to get more water because, well, whatever that is, it's fucking with my throat. I'll be right back. Ugh. Okay, I am back. Sorry about that. It actually felt like, I don't know what it was, but it almost felt like there was a piece of plastic stuck in my throat. That was fucking weird. Okay, let's get back to it. At least I got water now.
意識しようじゃねえか。こいつら親子の代わりにお前が貼り付けになれ。そうだな。1ヶ月生き延びりゃお前の命も見逃してやるぜ。どうする?
Okay, and again, a little bit more just establishing that the character is not just an asshole, he is actually cruel on top of that.
ヘルメッポのやつ、貼り付けにしたお兄ちゃんを殴ったり蹴ったり。
Although, I will say that the core punishment itself, like the idea of, oh, do you survive this long, is, you know, as long as they're feeding him, it's not that ridiculous. Let's see. Let's see, One Piece is the one anime I'm most conflicted about. I really want to catch up with the anime, but unlike most people, I liked the pre-time skip One Piece more. The art style, humor, it all felt great to watch. Okay, well, so I will say I watched the first, like, 20-something episodes of the show already. Well before I watched, but so I can't speak about post-time skip One Piece at all. But one thing I did actually really appreciate the slow pace of the introductory sequence where they slowly introduce the ensemble cast member by member so that they each kind of get their own little arc to both kind of establish their own character, their motivations, and also their dynamic with each individual cast member. Like, I felt that that was a very effective way to set up an ensemble cast for a long-term story. So I actually did really like that. It was once some of the filler episodes started to get introduced, because I don't even remember what the thing was, but I remember watching an episode, I'm like, oh, this was actually just filler, and I didn't care for it one bit. That's kind of when I ended up dropping it. I'm pretty sure I remember that there's a list out there somewhere of just kind of, that just lists the ways you should watch the show while excluding all of the the filler episodes. So I may end up catching up with that at some point. But yeah, I know the 4-digit episode count is something that's kind of putting me off. I might end up reading the manga at some point because I've heard a lot of really good things about the story, just overall, both in the early parts and the later parts. And I will also say I do kind of, from what I've seen, I tend to prefer the character design of the pre-time skip stuff to the post-time skip stuff. But then again, that could change actually seeing it in context. But yeah, but I've heard there's a lot of really good writing, and I really do want to experience it. But like, oof, it's a big ask because there's just so much, and because it seems like the stories actually connect with one another. It's not like I can just start halfway through like you might be able to with another show. Yeah. Yeah, I generally, in the same way, I generally don't like to skip over stuff, but I figure because there's like, there's just so much in One Piece that I feel like if I decided to do everything, I would just not be able to stick to it ultimately. And again, it's just because there's so much. It's like if I'm rewatching Avatar, for example, there's a couple filler episodes in there, but it's a concise enough show that I don't feel like I'm hurting my own enjoyment by watching the filler episodes. Even that one really annoying one that everybody hates because it got shown on reruns a million times. But something like One Piece, because it's going to translate to hours and hours of essentially non-productive runtime. That's the point where I kind of like, yeah. And I also do think it is a little. I know there's mixed opinions on this, but in my opinion, uh, filler episodes do kind of destroy the pacing of a lot of shows because they kind of interrupt the story at hand and don't really advance anything, which is a shame. So, but I'm talking about a maybe in the future. I don't think that's going to be anytime soon. While I am interested in watching more of One Piece, I also just this marathon alone is giving me so many shows I want to add to my backlog because oh boy, there's going to be a lot of stuff that I'm going to be wanting to watch. And there's already stuff on the list that I've been wanting to watch. Like I'm pretty sure because I know Frieren is on the list. I've been so excited to watch that. I've actually been holding off on starting it myself. And I was actually considering doing that as a stream thing instead of the light novels that we're doing, which is yeah. The One Piece said it's going to solve the pacing. Oh, good to know. Well, that is a consideration for future me. Let's just get back to watching the episode.
そうだったんですか。
洗えた。俺たち全員にタダで食わせろ。おい、早く酒持ってこい。またまたしてんじゃねえぞ、ほら。早くしろ。ああ、そうそう。ここのところ退屈だから明日ゾロを処刑することにしたぞ。みんな楽しみに待ってろ。
And again, I also do like the little nods to the idea that
なんだよ、お前は。
ルフィさんやめてください。
I mean, kind of one of the things about so as I was talking about earlier, is that this kind of does take some elements from real world Age of Pirates stuff, but also kind of does its own thing with things. And one of the things about the Age of Pirates era is that a lot of these colonies that were in the Caribbean area that the pirates tended to raid, a lot of times because they were so kind of isolated from everything else, they kind of ran independently. Well, there was a central authority in whatever country, like, whether they were England, France, Spain, Netherlands, anything like that, who were actually kind of had their foothold there. Ultimately, they were so far removed, it took so long for correspondence to happen that they kind of almost ran as their own little city-states. So that's one element they're showing here where we don't exactly know what the central authority really does, like what their rules are, what their morals are, what their MO is. But they're shown that the individual leaders in the general areas, like for example, this particular Navy commander, is essentially able to act autonomously, at least in the context of his own little jurisdiction. So, because, I mean, we can probably assume that the broader authority probably has some sort of proper justice system, even if it is a little bit trumped up, because that is also not uncommon in this type of setting. But the fact that he can just kind of arbitrarily decide, yeah, I'm going to arrest you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to do this, do that. Even the tyrannical governments of the past usually will at least have some sort of show to try to keep up appearances of legitimacy.
こいつクズだ。
殴りやがった
Hell,
な。
even places like
俺はモーガ
North
ン大佐
Korea
の息
and
子だぞ。
それがどうした。
like that, they still have trials, even if they
お
rate
前
their
がかか
results.
ってこいよ。ルフィさん落ち着いて。海軍を敵に回す気ですか。決めたぞコビー。俺はゾロを仲間にする。
And I also do like this little interaction as a way of showcasing that Luffy, while he kind of is a cavalier character in general, while he does kind of not really care a lot about what's going on around him, and he has his own goals and, is just kind of exploring the world as it comes to him, doesn't seem to have a whole lot of strong convictions. I do like that there are certain instances where, like, the moral nature of things will actually cut through all that and actually drive him to act, which, it's a good character trait, even though he does the thing of kind of hiding some of the moral nature of it and just kind of couching it in a veneer of, oh, this is how this will benefit me, which is like, hey, I want to have Zoro on my crew, and it's actually like, hey, you're killing a guy for doing a good thing. Fuck you, basically.
俺は偉い。
はっ、その通りであります、モーガン大佐。
その割には近頃貢ぎが少ねえんじゃねえか。
何分町の者たちの懐にも限界がありまして。
問題は俺への敬服度。そうじゃねえか。
Hey, just saying, don't worry about it. I mean, one thing I always say very much is that real life comes before my stream. That includes every aspect of that, like, is financially, especially, like, if there's ever any kind of problem with that, don't even make it a second thought that you have to actually do that. It's not something I expect or encourage from anyone. It's an option I leave open, but it's not something like again, don't feel like you owe anything to me. Again, I do appreciate your support, but again, it's not my. Again, I don't want people feeling bad if for whatever reason, even technical issues, they can't financially support me, because that's not how I operate. But have a good night. Yeah, hope I'll see you. Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be Inuyasha, so that should be fun. But yeah, have a good night. Thanks for stopping by. Oh, like I was saying, I completely got distracted. Even with ADHD meds, late nights after work do kind of result in brain going burr. But I will say this little interaction does kind of reinforce the thing I was talking about earlier, where the rulers can kind of act with autonomy, because the tribute system that I'm mentioning is basically naval feudalism, essentially. So, which in feudalism, while there was a central authority, there was a king or a shogun or whatever part of the world you're talking about, whether you're talking about like feudal Japan or feudalism of the Middle Ages in Europe. While there was a central authority, the local lords could kind of rule over their own areas as they saw fit, as long as they didn't cause problems for the overall structure of things. Oh, well, I am glad you are appreciating the content, because I enjoy making it. And I mean, I will say I'm also not the only person I know who likes Mushoku Tensei as much as I do. I mean, there were a couple of content creators who I'd seen beforehand that actually kind of were part of the reason I ended up watching it. Like, I know early on in the Mushoku Tensei streams, some of the earlier ones I did, where we saw, I mean, I know Natalie Hunter showed up a few times in the stream. She was one person who kind of was the little push I needed to actually kind of take a dive into Mushoku Tensei. So, again, there are others out there, but again, I do appreciate that you enjoy my content. Again, even though Mushoku Tensei wasn't really my main thing for a long time, it's still cool to have people actually engage with the stuff I'm doing. Yeah. I also do find it very interesting how One Piece has just these little Japanese-isms every so often. Like, well, it's definitely, it's inspired by Age of Pirates stuff, like the Caribbean pirates specifically. I shouldn't say just Age of Pirates, because there are pirates throughout history all over the world, but specifically when we think pirates, we usually think Caribbean pirates of like the 1400s to 1800s, or that era of piracy, which is well, it did kind of, the Americas do kind of had their own culture starting to kind of evolve and change from their roots, but it's still strongly inspired by European history, because it was mostly Europeans that were settling and colonizing the Americas at the time. So there wasn't really a whole lot of Eastern or Asian influence yet. But in this setting, while it's mostly inspired by that era, so it's mostly going to have those European style influences. I also do like every so often they have these little things that from Japan, like the fact that they had onigiri earlier, which are not really a thing that is very common over here or in Europe. That's really an Asian thing. Or the fact that they're fighting with kendo sticks. kendo is not super popular over here. So I do find that just, it's an interesting blend of cultural influences. And again, they're talking about they're fighting with kendo while he has two cutlasses on his shirt, which, cutlasses, kendo sticks are meant to kind of be closer, more than anything closer to like katanas, but cutlasses are, and scimitars, very different style of sword that is used for different types of fighting.
相変わらず弱いわねゾロ。
約束したんだ。俺はこんなところで死ぬわけにはいかねえんだ。
And again, I will say this particular flashback to establish character motivations, or at least part of it, is... Yeah, again, I feel a lot of what they're doing is a little on the nose,
ま
but
たおめえか。
this show as a whole does seem to kind of love being a little bit over the top, a little bit flamboyant in how it presents
俺は
itself.
一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
That's
Kotoaru!
a pretty
自
common
分から悪党になり下がろうってのか。
trend we've seen so far, so
海賊のどこが悪い？
海賊なんて
I
下
would
道だ。
probably be
誰
complaining
がなる
more
か
if it happened in a different
もともとお前悪い賞金
series,
稼ぎって
but
言
it
われて
actually
るん
does
だか
feel
ら。
kind of consistent
世
here.
間がどう言おうと勝手だが、俺は後悔するようなことはやっちゃいねえ。何が何でも生き延びて、俺は俺のやりたいことを成し遂げる。
はあ、そっか。でも俺はお前を仲間にするって決めた。
勝手に決めんな。
お前刀使うんだってな。
ああ、だがあのバカ息子が持ってっちまったよ。
俺が取り返してくるよ。
何？
だから刀が欲し
I
け
also
れ
do
ば俺
like
の
the
仲
little
間に
bit
な
of
れ。
the way that their kind of dueling quirkiness kind of makes this particular scene more complex than it really needs to be.
バカ！基地は反対だ。そっちじゃねえ。
ゴムゴムのロケット！
あいつ一体何者なんだ？
Yeah, because I mean, I ultimately feel like this, like that scene could have gone really different if either of them was normal. Like with Luffy in particular, like it would make so much sense if he just said, "Oh yeah, by the way, the guy's planning on executing you tomorrow, so you gotta have to change things up," as opposed to just kind of treating it like a social game essentially.
よーしそこで止めろ。一気に立たせるんだ。
親父、なんで仕返しに行かねえんだ。俺を殴ったやつだぜ。親父にも殴られたことのないこの俺の顔。
今までなぜ俺がお前を殴らなかったかわかるか？
それは親父にとって俺が。
そう。お前が。殴る価値もねえ。バカ息子だからよ。
Okay. Again, I do actually really like this. Again, character design, I think, of the villains is pretty consistently great. Especially the ones who are meant to be imposing like him. And again, I do also really like the contrast between the two different types of villains that we have in this particular episode, which have the combination of, again, but while they kind of hold the same type of position, whether both have leadership in the Navy and that's kind of their role and they're abusing their power and all that stuff. There's the one who kind of is the Nepo baby who gets things done, just leans on his position, and then there's the one who's actually strong, and they're both cruel in their own unique ways, and that causes them to butt heads with one another, and that's, it's a cool dynamic that, while it's never all that important long term, it allows for a lot of implied nuance to their dynamic, just so you can, again, have these kind of ideas almost brewing on an emotional level in the background as the events play out. And I do like that a lot, where they're able to kind of have this level of intrigue in the audience that doesn't necessarily require distracting from the actual plot at hand to establish that. Also, it's just silly to see him have an axe as an arm. That's his weapon. Like, again, this show is so over the top, and it's silly, but in a way that kind of fits the overall vibe it's going for. And I can appreciate when a show is just unapologetically ridiculous like that. And also, like I said before, I actually do really appreciate that they're showing a lot of characters using weapons that weren't common in actual pirate ages, like the spiked club from the previous episode, and now there's an axe that looks, honestly, it looks more like a wood cutting axe. No, actually, no, that's more of a battle axe. I'm dumb. Never mind. Yeah, it's more of a battle axe than anything, or of a single edged battle axe, because I know a lot of battle axes were double edged, but again, not something you'd normally see like a Caribbean pirate using.
あのチビならちゃんと俺が痛めつけて。
殺したんだろうな。
いや、だってあれまだほんのガキだし。
おいお前、町へ行って始末してこい。
そんなまだ幼い少女です。いくら大佐の命令でも。
たとえガキでも俺の命令に背けば反逆者だ。
しかしできません。
Okay, so I do find this little interaction interesting for a couple of reasons. For starters, it actually shows that while, we're kind of primed to assume that the younger Morgan is, just a straight up asshole, which he is, but they show he actually does have a little bit more of a conscience than his, straightforward, almost less selfish. I mean, he is selfish as well, but, selfish in a different way. His father, the other Morgan, they have a different type of selfishness, essentially. They have a different type of way of going about things, where he has kind of the hedonistic, arrogant type of power usage, while the father actually does have the kind of the iron, ruthless control type of thing. But I also do like how, as much as the younger Morgan is a total asshole, he's not going to kill a kid, because that's just not in his personality to do, whereas the older Morgan doesn't have any room to kind of say, basically it's like any disobedience is a threat, any threat must be eliminated. Even though we're kind of primed to almost think that the older Morgan was less of an asshole than the younger Morgan. Again, it's just two different ways of, having almost two different iterations of the same type of villain, essentially. Like they're both fundamentally different, but they're kind of put in a similar position. But I also find it very, very interesting that the naval guy, the soldier, while we do know that the rank and file Navy are not necessarily bad people, it's interesting that this instance we saw this guy openly defy the older the older Morgan, when they kind of just did quiet little acts of resistance against the younger Morgan earlier, which is just, it's weird, because I feel like they'd be more likely to openly defy the younger Morgan than the older Morgan, because the older Morgan, he's big, strong, and capable, and also very clearly shown to be actively violent, when the younger Morgan is, kind of an incompetent little dipshit. So I know this was done for the purpose of showing the older Morgan's brutality and how he just doesn't take any shit whatsoever. But it also just doesn't feel right for the soldier to actively defy the older Morgan. It just doesn't, for a group of people ruled by fear, that does not seem within character to do.
何もそこまで。
俺はこの腕っぷしで大佐にまで上り詰めた。いいか、世の中称号が全てだ。
Although I will say that's interesting
こ
that
の基
he's
地で
only a
最高位の
captain.
大佐であるこの俺は最高に優れた人間であるというこ
Like,
とだ。
I would assume that, I mean, captain in the Navy is nothing to scoff at, certainly, but I don't know. I would assume that the leader of this, of essentially a Navy fort, would be at a higher rank than captain.
だから俺のやることは全て正しい。違うかてめえら。
Although it's also interesting. It's like, is he like captain? Are they treating the base as essentially a vessel, and he's the captain of the vessel? Because that is actually a thing that happens sometimes. Sometimes there are things that are not vessels that can be treated as vessels for the naval purposes. Like, I know for a while the island of Guam was actually treated as was under the control of the U.S. Navy, and was actually run like it was an actual ship, where they had a captain who ran it, essentially as a dictator, because that's how captains of ships tend to be, just as far as authority and structure goes. So maybe that's what they're doing here, and he's essentially is the city is basically a vessel on paper, essentially. I don't know. Again, it probably doesn't matter. The actual ranks probably are, again, they probably don't matter at all for realistically. All that really matters is that we know he's the highest ranking naval officer in the area, and he's the one in charge of everything.
その通りであります。ガキの始末は後回しだ。見ろ、長い年月をかけてやっと完成した。これが俺の権力の象徴だ。さあ、象を起こせ。この基地の頂点に俺の偉大さを示すんだ。
I'll be honest. I mean, again, this is probably just my over analyzing looking, but I don't know that they're. I mean, that's a big ass statue. I'm not sure they're lifting it up that way as easily as they've been showing, but I don't know. Just I don't know. I feel like just some levers or pulleys or something like that would not be out of place when lifting up a large statue manually like that.
てゾロの刀を取り戻さないとな。あ。
おいお前。ぶつけやがったな。
あ。なんか上で音がしたな。
申し訳ありません。不注意でした。
この像は俺自身だと言ったはず。
I will also say,
傷一本、汚れ一つ
like, I
で
get
あれ
what
こ
they're
の
doing
俺
as
の
far
反
as
逆
the
だ。
行ってみよう。
as the the captain's insistence on loyalty, on forced loyalty, essentially is the idea of any step out of line is the same as betraying me. I get that they're establishing that aspect of his character, but they're also kind of making him irrational in the way that they're going about it, which I don't think fits the type of character he's meant to be, because he's meant to be ruthless and just has this iron grip on his power that he's unwilling to even just sacrifice an inch for any possible reason, even ones that would make sense. But they're taking it to such a level that he's acting in ways that don't make logical sense. Like in his the idea that, like, I get that he's upset that the building kind of knocked against his statue a little bit, and that it feels like that could kind of be a threat to his image and to his power. But blaming just one of the random guys pulling it for that little tap happening, it just doesn't seem like the kind of irrational thing this character would do. Because if nothing else, he's also been, as much as he's crazy and power hungry and just so tyrannical about his approach to things, he's also been portrayed as very capable aside from that. And people don't rise in power through their merit if they're like dumbasses. So I don't know, it feels like a slight inconsistency, like they're almost kind of sacrificing one element of his character development to showcase another aspect of his character development. I just feel like there's a different way they could have done that exact same thing that they were trying to do there. I will also say that as far as, I mean, this might just be a general world building thing, but these sailors do seem to be not as disciplined as you'd expect from this particular setting, because again, you'd feel like they'd be in complete lockstep due to just how authoritarian this particular captain is.
探してたんだ。一緒に来てくれ。返してほしいもんがあるんだよ。
ヘルメット様。
おい、逃がすな。
大佐、貼り付け場に誰かいます。
何？次から次に反逆者か。
And I will say, I do think also just in general, okay, and I do like the continual bits of, they haven't shown Nami as a real character just yet, but again, I like these little interludes they're doing where she just kind of happens to still be where the action is, doing her own thing for her own selfish reasons, even though we don't really have any character development aside from that. Again, it's a nice way to just show her as still being around and still keep her in mind, even though she's not the focus at the moment.
邪魔が入ったわね。ゾロの刀はどこだ。
I will say, in general, I do think some of the best voice acting so far has been in the villains.
なんだよ、
With
早く
the
言え
lady
よ。
pirate from the
戻
previous
んなきゃなんねえだ
episode,
ろ。
and also both versions of Morgan's, I think are very good.
やだ。撃てるもんなら撃ってみろ。
I'm actually also just curious because, again, I know that this dynamic is not going to be super important long term, but like, I almost feel like the captain wouldn't care if the son was shot. Like, I feel like it's not like a traditional system of, like, he is a nepo baby, but a lot of nepo babies can kind of count on protection from the the person they're benefiting off of. And I don't feel like this dynamic was established between both Morgans, where I don't feel like younger Morgan can actually rely on the protection of his father, because I feel like the father would just say, you know what, if avoiding harm to him would actually come at any kind of cost to my objectives, you should ignore that and just shoot and kill him, as long as you also kill the other guy. So, I don't know, I feel like that hesitation wouldn't necessarily
僕はもうこんな海軍見てられない。僕は正しい海兵になりたいんです。
やめろ。俺は逃げるわけにはいかねえんだ。あと10日は。
あなたは明日処刑されるんですよ。
何？
ヘルメッポは初めからあなたとの約束を守る気なんてなかったんだ。だからルフィさんは怒ってヘルメッポを殴ったんです。
あいつが。
ルフィさんも今は海軍に追われる身です。
And I will say, one thing I do actually like, I think this is probably a better use of Kobe than has been in the previous episode, where, again, he's kind of an exposition machine so far. While in the previous episode it did feel really forced, I actually do think the way they established his character up to this point actually makes it really work with the idea of him saying, oh yeah, by the way, this is the actual reality of the situation. I'm not playing this game with you. I have honorable goals. And that's how we can kind of tell some of the, the little deeper character stuff going on with Luffy that he is unwilling to share with Zoro directly. So Kobe kind of does it in his stead. And I think it's pretty well done at this point. I think this interaction, as far as delivering a little bit of exposition, both for character stuff and also kind of getting the characters on the same page, I think it's better done here than it has been at any point previously, with this character specifically.
だけどお願いです。ルフィさんに力を貸してください。ゾロさんを助けられるのはルフィさんだけです。そして今ルフィさんを助けられるのもゾロさんだけだと僕は思います。
One little bit of criticism I will give is, Kobe's kind of is working to release Zoro because the idea that Luffy can't go up against the captain in his current state. It's like, he's bit off more than he can chew, and that he's going to have issues ultimately, and that he needs Zoro's help. At the moment, I don't feel like they've established that super well, where I don't feel like, I mean, we do see the threat of the captain, but I don't feel like we've established that the captain is necessarily able to overpower Luffy, because we saw Luffy as a very powerful character up to this point, and I mean, before we learn any of his weaknesses, because I mean, they haven't revealed that the Devil Fruit power people can't swim or anything like that, or the fact that they have any weaknesses whatsoever. At the moment, Luffy comes across as pretty overpowered. So it doesn't we don't quite emotionally resonate with this idea that Luffy needs Zoro at this moment, because it's still conceivable that Luffy could just beat the crap out of this guy regardless. So, I don't know. I get what they're doing here, but again, I feel like they're trying to establish something that we just kind of have to take their word for it. And I also do like that. I actually do like that verbiage right there. The the phrasing of for the crime of treason against me, like that not just for the crime of treason or crime of high treason as you'd normally expect. He's specifically putting the treason against him as the crime itself, and not just treason in a general sense. Shows his arrogance. It's good character work done with just a little offhand line of dialogue. I really like that.
この部屋だな。
Again, I love how it says my room in English on the door.
でも3本もあるぞ。おい、ゾロの刀はどれだ？なんだ、気絶してら。お、コビ。
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I could complain about the gun safety there just because, I mean, they're not ready to shoot yet, so they shouldn't have their finger on the trigger, but also, if you're gonna break that particular rule of gun safety, this is about the best time you could break it, because, again, you're pointing your gun at someone you intend to fire at before too long anyway, so, you know, I get it, but even so, they shouldn't have their finger on the boomstick.
ことをやってくれるじゃねえか。おめえたち。あの麦わら小僧と3人でクーデターでも起こそうってのか。
俺はずっと一人で戦ってきた。兵隊を取り巻きに威張り腐ってるおめえとは違ってな。
ロロノアゾロ。この俺を甘く見るなよ。貴様の強さなどこの俺の権力の前では勝つ同然だ。構えろ。俺は。
Yeah, but I also do like the soft little showcase of how he can push the captain's buttons by playing against his arrogance, but not in such a way that it actually is able to bait him into doing something stupid. So I think that's actually pretty good character work. At least as far as the villain goes.
相変わらず弱いわね、ゾロ。
Again, these little flashbacks are a little heavy-handed, but I will also say, again, this kind of contributes to the notion I was talking about earlier, where we don't see why Luffy needs Zoro in this moment, because, again, he kind of comes across as overpowered to the point where, you know, even bullets don't affect him. Like, and I get that they're using black powder muskets, so it's not as powerful as modern day weapons, but you know, at close range, those still are going to tear through most people, and you know, even you would assume it does this because essentially at that range, bullets, well, they are technically, you know, again, musket ball. It's not a pointy or sharp thing. It essentially is more of a penetrating force than a concussive force. So we saw the concussive force in the previous episode doesn't affect him, because he's just rubber, it bounces right off of him. But now we see that even penetrative force does fucking nothing against him. So what weaknesses does he really have at this point? What can actually overcome him if a point-blank volley of musket rounds can't hurt him? Like, again, they don't even slow him down. He just, again, eats the bullets and flings them out. So, yeah, so it's still, again, it does not inspire any strong belief that he needs Zoro to take down this captain right now. I can understand why he wants him on his crew, but again, they were trying to establish a dynamic that I don't feel is really backed up by what they're actually showcasing. Because I would say that the one thing that I was thinking that could actually kind of lend to that thing actually making sense is the idea that, okay, you know, maybe concussive stuff doesn't really work on him, but the captain has an axe, so, you know, he might not be able to be bonked, but he can get cut. At this point, this is bringing into question, does that even impact him at all? Because, again, at the moment, well, before they've introduced more about what Luffy is and is not capable of, a blind viewer would not know the extent of his abilities. They don't know if he's anything but overpowered, because that's all we've seen of him so far. So, again, it kind of somewhat undermines the threat they're trying to build with the captain. So yeah, like I was saying in the previous episode, Again, one of the things I do actually like about the early parts of One Piece is that it takes the introductory sequences very, very slowly, and I don't. And while in other shows that could be a very bad thing, in One Piece it's actually very good because of the fact they have an ensemble cast, and they slowly introduce and give each individual cast member their own little dedicated arc to establish their characters and also introduce them to the main cast and to the rest of the crew, and so that they build those individual and group dynamics in a way that actually like really does do a strong setup for the story to come. So that is something I actually do really appreciate about it. And there are a lot of little things I am liking about what this show is doing. Some of the little other like little bits of world building, little reinforcing of certain minor themes and ideas does leave a bit to be desired, but overall I do think I actually really like what it's doing. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, the one issue I'm going to have is that the way I'm structuring my particular video by only judging the first 3 episodes, that approach is actually going to harm the final grade of One Piece. I'll acknowledge it in the final video, but you know, it is actually ultimately going to probably get a lower grade than it would realistically deserve if I actually took the entire. Because like we got the idea that Kobe, while he does have a little bit of a cowardly streak to him, he does have ultimately noble intentions, and he wants to fundamentally kind of work towards a position where he can actually do noble things for a righteous cause. And that's kind of where his character is leading towards. The fact that he's so quickly transitioned from coward to willing to die for the right thing does feel like it's the kind of thing that needs a little bit more time to cook to actually be believable. But again, ultimately, this feels like the natural endpoint to his character that just hasn't. Okay. And again, that was also just a very Japanese style of doing like a sword kill like that. Aside from the fact that, first of all, he does have katanas, which is, again, that's a Japanese thing, not a pirate thing, or at least not a Caribbean pirate thing, because this is mostly inspired by Caribbean pirates, but they do have little bits of Japanese thrown in there, with the katanas being one example. But also it's he did the samurai thing of almost like teleporting behind the enemy, and then you slowly, after a pause, you realize that he's been cut open. That, again, that's a very that's like a samurai trope that they're including in this Caribbean pirate inspired show. And I think those little mixes of cultural influences, it doesn't feel quite correct for Zoro to be as skeptical as he is about getting a ship, just because again, while it's kind of following its own rules in many ways, one thing that was really common in the Caribbean pirates, which is again where a large amount of this show's influence comes from, most pirates in that setting stole their ships. Like they didn't have the money to actually buy a ship. They just found one they liked and said, "Yeah, this is mine now." Like a lot of the reason he exists as a character at all is just to be a vector for exposition. And I mean, honestly, he hasn't done really much of anything aside from that one bit of self-sacrifice, except for exposition. Like he's just been exposition after exposition after exposition. That seems to be his entire role in the story. And yeah, honestly, again, I feel like maybe I would grow to like him more if he actually served a larger purpose in the story, and actually we got to see his character development rather than kind of speedrunning to the end point like we saw earlier in the episode. But overall, yeah, it's fine. I also do find it very interesting where they talk about the Navy, you know, running these screening checks. In this setting, there's so many pirates, like even more so than the actual historical period they're basing it off of, where I feel like they have to be aware that conscripts are a thing. Some people are not going to be on pirate ships by choice. They're going to be kind of, again, forced into it. They're going to be press ganged, basically. So I feel like they would have some sort of contingency in place to not automatically disqualify anyone who was ever forced to join a pirate ship. And also, like, even in the real world, there were instances where pirates were actually somewhat valued if they had experience, where, you know, privateers were a thing, where it was not uncommon for pirates to eventually become legit. Well, I wouldn't say it wasn't uncommon, but it was known that there were instances where pirates were able to basically become legitimate and do piracy on behalf of the government. So I mean, the governments of the time did recognize that there was value in an experienced pirate if you can actually utilize them. So, again, I feel like it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that he'd be immediately disqualified if you actually like really think about the world building implications of that. So, again, I'm not entirely sure what pirate means in this universe because it doesn't seem to mean the exact same thing as it does in the real world. Because as much as they call themselves pirates, it's like, yeah, we're pirates, yada yada yada, and that would naturally put them against the Navy. At the same time, I don't think they've actually committed any acts of piracy yet. So like, they haven't committed any crimes. It's like you say you can call yourself a gangster, but if you haven't actually done anything illegal, what that's not a crime, you know? I deal with my cat because she is deciding to be difficult because I actually started yesterday building a gunpla. I was having fun with it. I put all the pieces to the side on a specific spot, and she just jumped on them. Like, fortunately, she didn't knock them down. And, I'll give her a little bit of pets just to send her on her way. But, ooh, if I didn't get it right then, she probably would have scattered them. And a speed run Kobe's character development. That's ultimately a good. I don't know. I like the end point. I just don't quite like how they got there because, again, the little flashes of heroism underneath a cowardly character is a tried and true character arc, character trope. But again, I don't quite buy it with Kobe. Oh, that was on purpose. I feel like you could have guessed that just based on the scene itself. You don't need somebody to verbally confirm that. Again, when it comes to writers not letting audiences figure stuff out for themselves, that is one of my pet peeves with writing. So while it's not, I acknowledge it's probably not the biggest deal to most people. In this is the kind of thing that really does bug me. So I have to point it out when I watch for me. And again, as much as the review I'm going to do will be mainly based on the first 3 episodes, I can't ignore the fact that I have seen beyond it in the past. But I mean, I will say one of the things I do overall like about the show is that it does take its time to establish the core ensemble cast, and these first 3 episodes only established the first 2 crew members so far, and honestly, it barely even did much as far as character development goes. Just this kind of establishing baselines because we got little hints at Luffy's and Zoro's motivations, but nothing really substantial. And then we had some hints, some teasers of Nami, because I know she's been kind of just in the background of the scenes up to this point. So again, it's still very much in the early stages at this point in the show. But I will say that while I do think that the biggest strength of early One Piece is how slowly it introduces each of the ensemble cast members and how it actually takes the time to really give them proper care as part of the story. Even without that context, which I think actually is, something that really is to One Piece's strength, I do feel like these first 3 episodes actually did serve to pretty effectively get you interested in the show to come. Where again, it's not even close to finished setting up the broader story. There's still so much that it hasn't. I mean, honestly, it's barely even scratched the surface of what things go because it hasn't even. I mean, most of the main ensemble cast members are like still just kind of twinkles in the writer's eye at this point. So I know that comes later, but overall, one of the factors I am going to rate these things on as far as the final ranking video goes is, how much do I enjoy it? I enjoyed it reasonably well enough. I do kind of want to see some of the more in-depth, longer form storytelling, but it just hasn't gotten to that point yet, so it's not going to be 100% to my taste at this point, but I did enjoy it well enough. Then also is how well does it encourage you to want to watch the rest of the show, and I think that does a very good job of establishing some of the core elements of the world, getting you up to speed with the general gist of what's going on, stuff that can be expanded on later, and also just it serves as a good hook to the main characters and to the plot ahead of time and kind of gives you an idea of what to expect moving forward. And on technical side of things, while the animation, nothing particularly special, I think the character design is very good. I think the fight choreography, while it is a little shorter than I would like, I think it works for what it is. It's very inventive. A lot of the choreography is kind of clever. They do interesting things with it that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And also, just as far as the writing goes, they're doing a lot of little things as well as the over-the-top things. So, yeah, there's definitely a core level of competency. So I will say that if I was to take like the first 20 some episodes into consideration, it would actually probably be like an S tier introduction, because I do really respect just how long, how slowly it, how much it's willing to be patient in establishing everything. But as is, if just the first 3 episodes, honestly, it probably still deserves an A tier. I think it's actually a very good introductory sequence to a long running shonen. Like, honestly, it's a lot stronger than most shonen tend to be in their first couple episodes. So yeah, overall, again, my final decision will be when I actually work on this section of the script. But as a preliminary estimate, I would say probably A tier overall. So yeah, that's going to be it for this evening. I do appreciate everyone who showed up. Whether you chatted or just lurked or anything in between, that is always very much appreciated. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, will be the final stream this week, because this weekend I have a wedding to go to, so I will not be home to stream. But tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be watching Inuyasha, and that'll be the first episode of the first anime of the 2000s. So we're getting actually really close to. I mean, okay, granted, we're still going to have another fucking 25 anime to watch, but another big milestone. We're past the 1990s. Finish it off today, so hope to see you tomorrow to get all that started. If not, I will see you as early as next Monday for whatever we're watching next. Or a week from Sunday, if you don't want to watch the marathon streams, we're going to be back with finishing off the Volume 1 of Mushoku Tensei light novels a week from Sunday at 9 a.m. Eastern. So hope to see you on one of those streams.